and Ted. That is how the memo begins. 2 first names, no titles, no formal salutation. It is dated August 9th, 1966. Its author is the coordinator of a scientific committee at the University of Colorado that has not yet officially begun its work. Its recipients are 2 senior administrators of that university. Its subject line, typed at the top of the page, reads as follows: Some thoughts on the UFO project. The author is a man named Robert Lowe. The university is being asked to host an Air Force study of unidentified flying objects. There is internal resistance. Some of the faculty think the project will damage the school's prestige. The author is writing to talk them down. On the second page of the memo, after a survey of who inside the university favors the project and who opposes it, Robert Lowe writes the sentence the rest of this episode is about. Quote, "The trick would be, I think, to describe the project so that to the public it would appear a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer." End quote. The next sentence in the memo is the operating instruction. Quote, "One way to do this would be to stress investigation, not of the physical phenomena, but rather of the people who do the observing, the psychology and sociology of persons and groups who report seeing UFOs." End quote. That memo was written 3 months before the committee it describes formally began its work. Its author was the committee's own coordinator. The committee in question would be known to history as the Condon Committee. Its report, when it was published 2.5 years later, would end the United States Air Force's public investigation of unidentified flying objects. In the room where Robert Lowe typed those sentences, a verdict was already on the page. This is the story of how that verdict got executed, who paid the price for letting the public see the memo, and what the Air Force was doing in the rooms where the public was not allowed.
This is Unresolved Signals, an AI-powered investigation into the oldest open question in human history. Every document, every country, every question, every release.
Every source cited in this episode is linked at unresolvedsignals.com. The story begins on a country road in Ohio, on the morning of the 17th of April, 1966, 4 months before Robert Lowe typed the trick memo, 5 months before the committee began its work. At about 5 o'clock in the morning, Deputy Sheriff Dale SPOWER and his partner, Patrolman Wilbur Neff, were patrolling the southeast portion of Portage County. SPOWER was a Korean War veteran. He had been an Air Force gunner. He was 34 years old. In their signed report, which they later sent to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, and which was forwarded to the United States Air Force, the 2 officers described what happened next. Quote, "The object came directly overhead and hovered above us. Its light lit up the ground where we were standing, and our cruiser P-13. It was too bright to look at without hurting the eyes." End quote. The object began to move. The deputies got back in their cruiser and pursued it. They chased it east, across the Ohio state line into Pennsylvania. Their signed statement records the speed in their own words. Quote, "At times we measured its speed over the ground at about 103 miles per hour." End quote. In East Palestine, Ohio, Patrolman Wayne H.D. Wston joined the chase. In his signed statement, he described what he saw. Quote, "At 5:30 in the morning, the object went over me at what I thought was around 800 feet. The object appeared to look like a large ice cream cone with point down. The pointed part didn't look solid, looked more like light beams." End quote. 85 miles east of where the chase began, in Conway, Pennsylvania, Patrolman Frank Panzanella was standing in a parking lot when the chase ended. His signed statement, dated May 18, 1966, recorded what he saw in his words. Quote, "The object was the shape of a half of football, was very bright, and about 25 to 35 feet in diameter." End quote. Panzanella had been watching it for 10 minutes before the cruiser arrived. He saw it ascend. 4 officers, 3 jurisdictions, an 85-mile chase, a signed witness statement from each. 5 days later, on the 22nd of April, the director of Project Blue Book, Major Hector Quintanilla, issued his conclusion. He had conducted a brief telephone interview with one of the 4 officers. He had not interviewed the others. His conclusion, communicated through Air Force channels and to local police, was that what the officers had chased was first a communications satellite. After the satellite had crossed the horizon, his conclusion continued. What they had chased was the planet Venus. In Conway, Pennsylvania, Sheriff Ross Dussman was asked by United Press International for his reaction. His reply was published on The Wire. Quote, "I've seen Venus many times, but I never saw Venus 50 feet above a road and moving from side to side like this was." End quote. J. Allen Hynek, the Northwestern astronomer who had served as Project Blue Book's scientific consultant for almost 20 years, was asked the same question. His answer, recorded at the time, was a single word. Absurd. Ohio Congressman William Stanton issued a statement, quote, "The Air Force has suffered a great loss of prestige in this community. Once people entrusted with the public welfare no longer think the people can handle the truth, then the people, in return, will no longer trust the government," end quote. In Richmond, Virginia, the editorial board of the Richmond News Leader read the wire copy and wrote its own response. Quote, "Attempts to dismiss the reported sightings under the rationale as exhibited by Project Blue Book won't solve the mystery and serve only to heighten the suspicion that there's something out there that the Air Force doesn't want us to know about," end quote. The country was laughing at the Air Force. Something had to be done. 6 months later, on the 9th of October, 1966, a Cleveland Plain Dealer staff writer named John DeGroot, in a piece carried that Sunday on the Associated Press wire, sat down with Dale SPOWer in a small apartment. SPOWer had left the sheriff's department. His marriage was over. He was working as a painter. He was 34 years old. DeGroot's piece ran under a single headline: "He chased a flying saucer. Now his life is shattered." What follows are SPOWer's own words, on the record, 6 months after the Air Force told the country that what he had seen was Venus. Quote, "If I could change all that I have done in my life, I would change just one thing, and that would be the night we chased that damn thing, that saucer," end quote. Quote, "My entire life came crashing down around my shoulders. Everything changed. I still don't really know what happened, but suddenly it was as though everybody owned me, and I no longer had anything for myself. My wife, my home, my children, they all seemed to fade away," end quote. Quote, "I have become a freak. I'm so damn lonely. Look at me, 34 years old, and what do I have? Nothing," end quote. In the same article, DeGroot quoted Wayne Houston, the East Palestine patrolman who had joined the chase. Houston had also resigned from the police force. Quote, "Sure, I quit because of that thing. People laughed at me, and there was pressure. You couldn't put your finger on it, but the pressure was there. The city officials didn't like police officers chasing flying saucers," end quote. DeGroot also reached Spower's wife, Denise. Quote, "Something happened to Dale, but I don't know what it was. He came home that day, and I never saw him more frightened before. They hounded him right into the ground," end quote. And then there is the document the United States Air Force itself produced about these officers. On the 17th of May, 1966, 1 month after the chase, an information officer at the headquarters of the 911th Troop Carrier Group at Greater Pittsburgh Airport wrote a letter to Project Blue Book. The officer's name was Eugene F. Rarer. He was forwarding the witness statements of Patrolman Panzanella and the now former patrolman Wayne H. Wston. The letter is on Air Force letterhead. It reads in part, quote, "Mr. Wayne H. Wston, formerly Patrolman Wayne Houston, does not wish his name identified with his statement. He has been harassed by news media and private organizations and individuals. He has been misquoted by news media and is constantly bothered by telephone calls. Possibly the above mention may have been a deciding factor. Mr. Houston resigned his position with the police force and accepted employment in another area," end quote. On its own letterhead, in writing, the Air Force conceded that one of the 4 officers who had filed signed statements that morning had been driven off his police force by the consequences of the explanation the Air Force had issued. No corresponding letter was written to Dale SPOWer. This was the state of Project Blue Book in the spring of 1966. A planetarium director was correcting the Air Force on the location of stars. A congressional minority leader was demanding hearings. A newspaper editorial in Virginia was telling its readers there was something out there the Air Force did not want them to know about. And in Ohio and Pennsylvania, 4 officers who had filed signed statements describing what they had seen had been told on the record that they had chased Venus. And one of them was sitting in an apartment 6 months later, telling a wire reporter that everyone he loved had faded away. Something had to be done. Something was about to be. In April of 1966, in the same week that Dale SPOWer's signed statement was being forwarded up the Air Force chain of command, the House Committee on Armed Services convened hearings on Project Blue Book. The hearings had been demanded by Representative Gerald Ford of Michigan, the Republican minority leader, after sightings in his own congressional district had been publicly attributed by the project to swamp gas. We told that story in our last episode. At the hearings, J. Allen Hynek testified. He had spent 2 decades inside Project Blue Book. He had argued with Major Quintanilla privately. He had publicly called the Venus explanation absurd. Now, in front of the committee, he made his recommendation, on the record. The Air Force, he said, should commission a civilian panel of physical and social scientists to undertake a thorough independent review of the Blue Book case record. The Air Force agreed. In July of 1966, the Air Force issued a contract worth $313,000 to the University of Colorado at Boulder. The contract was worth more than the entire annual operating budget of Project Blue Book. The recipient of the contract, the man who would chair the study, was a 64-year-old physicist named Edward U. Condon. Condon was not a UFO researcher. He was an institutional figure. He had been director of the National Bureau of Standards. He had served as president of the American Physical Society. He had survived a long, ugly fight with the House Un-American Activities Committee in the late 1940s and early 1950s. By 1966, he was at the University of Colorado, and his name carried weight. To run the day-to-day administration of the project, Condon appointed a coordinator. The coordinator was a younger man, an administrator at the University of Colorado with a background in the Office of Naval Research. His name was Robert J. Lowe. On August 9, 1966, 3 months before the committee formally began its work, Robert Lowe sat down at a typewriter in his office and produced a one-page memorandum. The memorandum was addressed to E. James Archer, Dean of the Graduate School, and Thurston E. Manning, Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Colorado. They were the senior administrators who had been resisting the university's acceptance of the Air Force contract. The memo begins conversationally. Quote, "Jim and Ted, I have pondered the UFO project and talked to a number of persons about it. Here are a few thoughts on the subject." End quote. The first half of the memo surveys who inside the university is for the project and who is against it. Louis Branscombe is against it. Gordon Little thinks it would be a disaster. George Denton is negative. Their argument, in Lowe's summary, is that taking the project on means publicly admitting the possibility that UFOs exist, and that any such admission would damage the university's standing in the scientific community. Walter Roberts of the National Center for Atmospheric Research is in favor. Roberts has told Lowe that Colorado is the Air Force's first choice. He has told Lowe that hosting the project, if done right, would put the university in good standing with what Lowe calls, quote, "the right circles," end quote. Lowe has weighed the arguments. He has reached a conclusion. He has a recommendation. In the second half of the memorandum, in the section titled Comments, Lowe writes the following, quote, "The analogy with ESP, Rhine, and Duke is only partially valid. The Duke study was done by believers who, after they had finished, convinced almost no one. Our study would be conducted almost exclusively by non-believers who, although they couldn't possibly prove a negative result, could and probably would add an impressive body of evidence that there is no reality to the observations." End quote. The next sentence is the one that would, 18 months later, end the committee's credibility. Quote, "The trick would be, I think, to describe the project so that, to the public, it would appear a totally objective study, but, to the scientific community, would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer." End quote. The next sentence, the one less often quoted, is the operating instruction. Quote, "One way to do this would be to stress investigation, not of the physical phenomena, but rather of the people who do the observing. The psychology and sociology of persons and groups who report seeing UFOs." End quote. Lowe closes the memo with the following note, quote, "I'm inclined to feel at this early stage that if we set up the thing right and take pains to get the proper people involved and have success in presenting the image we want to present to the scientific community, we could carry the job off to our benefit." End quote. We could carry the job off to our benefit. There is a defensible reading of this memo. In that reading, Lowe is an administrator handling a hostile faculty. He is selling a skeptical project to skeptics. The word trick, in 1966 administrative English, could mean the way to thread the needle, the knack of the thing. Read that way, the memo is poorly worded, not predetermined. We have read it for you. You can read it yourself. The full text is on our source page. Here is what the memo on its face recommends. The project is to be presented to the public as objective. It is to be presented to the scientific community as appropriately skeptical. It is to be staffed almost exclusively by non-believers. It is to study the witnesses rather than the phenomena. And the conclusion the chief coordinator believes the staff will, in his words, probably reach, is that there is no reality to the observations. 3 months before the work begins, the memo was filed. For 18 months, no one outside the committee read it. In January of 1967, 6 months into a study scheduled to last 18, Edward U. Condon traveled to Corning, New York, and addressed a public audience. The remarks were public. According to David Saunders, a member of Condon's own committee staff, and to the historian David Jacobs writing in 1975, Condon told the audience that, in his opinion, UFO reports were, in his word, nonsense. He then, by these accounts, added a phrase, quote, "But I'm not supposed to reach that conclusion for another year," end quote. The contemporary local press clipping has not been pulled. The quote survives through accounts written by colleagues who heard about it later. We are reporting it here as the historical record received it. If Condon said it as recorded, then the chair of the Independent Scientific Review of the United States Air Force's investigation of unidentified flying objects, in January of 1967, with a year of work still ahead of him, with witnesses still to be interviewed and case files still to be analyzed, told a public audience that he already knew his answer, and joked about not yet being scheduled to deliver it. By January of 1967, somewhere outside the committee, someone else had already started doing the actual work. The man's name was James E. McDonald. He was the senior physicist at the University of Arizona's Institute of Atmospheric Physics, where he served as associate director. He held a PhD from Iowa State University. He was a working atmospheric physicist of the highest standing in his field. In 1966, McDonald did something his peers were not willing to do. He started taking the UFO question seriously. He filed Freedom of Information requests. He read Project Blue Book case files. He interviewed witnesses. By his own count, he interviewed hundreds of them. He read every academic paper on the subject. He read the correspondence files of the Air Force consultants. He talked to Hynek. He talked to airline pilots. He talked to radar operators. He kept reading. On the 29th of July, 1968, 6 months before the Condon report was scheduled to be released, McDonald walked into a hearing room of the House Committee on Science and Astronautics and delivered his prepared statement. What follows are McDonald's own words, in his own statement, in the public record of the United States Congress on July 29, 1968. We are reading them as he read them. Quote, "No other problem within your jurisdiction is of comparable scientific and national importance." End quote. Quote, "The scientific community as a whole won't take this problem seriously because it doesn't have scientific data. They want instrumental data. Why don't they have instrumental data? Because the scientists don't take it seriously enough to get the scientific data." End quote. Quote, "Credible observers are observing relatively incredible objects. That was said 16 years ago, and it is still occurring." End quote. McDonald was quoting a former Air Force Director of Intelligence, Major General Samford. We told that story in our episode on the 1952 Washington Wave. McDonald was reaching back 16 years and turning the Air Force's own historical concession against the project that had inherited it. Quote, "There is a real ridicule lid that has not been contrived by any group. It just has evolved in the way the whole problem has unfolded." End quote. Quote, "The scientific world at large is in for a shock when it becomes aware of the astonishing nature of the UFO phenomenon." End quote. McDonald did not testify alone. The hearing also took testimony from Hynek, from Carl Sagan, from Robert L. Hall, from James A. Harder, and from Robert M. L. Baker. 6 scientists, 6 perspectives, on the public record. But McDonald's prepared statement was the sharpest. He was the only senior scientist at the witness table arguing that Project Blue Book, as constituted, was incapable of conducting a scientifically serious investigation of the question. His specific recommendation on the record was for what he called, quote, "a pluralistic approach," end quote. Multiple agencies, NASA, the National Science Foundation, the Office of Naval Research, not a single Air Force project, not a single committee on a single university campus. A distributed scientific infrastructure capable of doing what Project Blue Book had been failing to do for 20 years. McDonald's testimony was entered into the congressional record. The Condon Committee was, at this point, 6 months from publication. McDonald already had a working theory of what the Condon report would say, and he was speaking, before Congress, against the report he could see coming. He was, in the summer of 1968, the only credentialed atmospheric physicist of his rank in the country saying any of this in public. He would pay for it for the rest of his life. On the 24th of February, 1968, while McDonald was preparing his case and Condon was preparing his summary, Edward Condon's own administrative assistant resigned. Her name was Mary Louise Armstrong. She had managed the project's day-to-day correspondence. She had been the staff member Condon trusted most. Her resignation letter ran 10 pages. It enumerated 9 specific criticisms of Robert Lowe's leadership. It documented what she described as a profound internal split between the staff who were doing the actual investigative work and the project leadership that was steering the conclusions. The letter is reproduced in full in the book the fired committee members would publish later that year. We are not quoting it on this show because we have not been able to retrieve a verbatim primary copy. 2 months after Armstrong's letter, in April of 1968, 2 members of the Condon Committee staff were fired by Edward Condon. Their names were David Saunders and Norman Levine. The reason given for their dismissal was that they had leaked an internal document to outside parties. The document was the Lowe Memorandum, the August 9, 1966 memo to Jim and Ted, the Trick Memo. Saunders and Levine had become aware of the memo earlier that year. They had given a copy to MacDonald. MacDonald had given a copy to a journalist named John Fuller. Fuller, in May of 1968, published the memo in Look magazine, in an article titled simply, Flying Saucer Fiasco. The committee's coordinator, in an internal memo, had written down the word trick. 18 months later, the public could read it. David Saunders, with co-author R. Roger Harkins, published a book in October of 1968. Its title is a question and an exclamation. UFOs? Question mark? Yes, exclamation mark. Where the Condon Committee went wrong. The book reproduced the Lowe memo in its appendix. It reproduced Mary Louise Armstrong's letter. It documented, from the inside, what the committee had become. By the autumn of 1968, the Condon Committee's legitimacy had, in any honest sense, collapsed. 2 of its scientists had been fired. Its administrative coordinator had resigned. Its smoking gun internal memo had been published in a national magazine. Its chair had been quoted joking, in public, about already knowing his conclusion before the work was done. And the report was still being written. On the 7th of October, 1968, 3 days before Saunders and Harkins published their book, J. Allen Hynek received a letter at his office at Northwestern University. The letter was from Colonel Raymond Sleeper, commander of the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Sleeper was, at that point, the Air Force's senior intelligence officer responsible for the analysis of foreign technology. Project Blue Book reported, administratively, through his command. Hynek was a civilian consultant to that command. He had been one for 20 years. Sleeper's letter was a formal request. For the first time in those 20 years, the Air Force officer to whose command Blue Book reported was asking him, directly, in writing, for his candid scientific assessment of the project. Hynek's reply, dated October 7, 1968, ran several pages. It was organized as 8 numbered observations. We are paraphrasing those observations here from Hynek's 1972 book, in which the letter is reproduced. The single passage we will quote verbatim, because it is universally attested across primary and secondary reproductions, is Observation 4. Observation 1. Neither of Blue Book's 2 missions, Hynek wrote, were being adequately executed. Neither the assessment of UFOs as a national security threat, nor the gathering of scientific data from cases. Observation 2. The staff of Blue Book, in numbers and in scientific training, was grossly inadequate. Observation 3. Blue Book was a closed system. Hynek wrote that there was virtually no scientific dialogue between Blue Book and the outside scientific world. Observation 4. Read verbatim. Quote, "The statistical methods employed by Blue Book are nothing less than a travesty." End quote. Observation 5. There had been a lack of attention to significant cases and too much time spent on routine cases and on peripheral public relations tasks. Hynek's specific recommendation, in his words, concentrate on 2 or 3 potentially scientifically significant cases per month, instead of being spread thin over 40 to 70. Observation 6. The information input to Blue Book was grossly inadequate. Hynek attributed this to the almost consistent failure of UFO officers at local air bases to transmit useful information up the chain. Observation 7. The basic attitude and approach within Blue Book was, in Hynek's words, illogical and unscientific. Observation 8. Inadequate use had been made of the project's own scientific consultant. Hynek noted that only cases the project monitor deemed worthwhile were brought to his attention. His scope of operation, he wrote, had been consistently thwarted. He often learned of interesting cases a month or 2 after the report had reached Blue Book. In the same letter, Hynek noted that Blue Book's critics had given the project a name. He did not disagree with it. The name they had given it was, quote, "The Society for the Explanation of the Uninvestigated," end quote. That letter was not for the public. It was a private response to a formal internal request. It would not be published until Hynek's 1972 book, 4 years later. But on the 7th of October 1968, in the file of the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, sat the most direct internal critique the project's own scientific consultant had ever written. He had been the public face of the Air Force's UFO work for 20 years. He had given his name and his credentials to the explanations the project had issued. On October 7, 1968, in writing, at his command's formal request, he stopped. In January of 1969, 3 months after Hynek's letter to Sleeper, the Condon Committee published its report. Its formal title was Scientific Study of Unidentified Flying Objects. It ran 965 pages. Edward U. Condon's name was on the cover. The summary, written by Condon, was the part the press read. Its conclusion is reproduced verbatim in every history of the period. Quote, "Our general conclusion is that nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. Careful consideration of the record as it is available to us leads us to conclude that further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified in the expectation that science will be advanced thereby." End quote. That sentence is what the country was told the Condon Report said. The body of the report, behind the summary, was a different document. The Condon Report's case studies, written by the working investigators rather than by Condon, contained dozens of cases the committee's own staff had been unable to explain. Some of these cases were classified, by the investigators themselves, in the body of the report, with the same word the Air Force had been trying to scrub from Blue Book statistics for 15 years: unidentified. The summary did not emphasize this. In the spring of 1969, the National Academy of Sciences convened a panel of senior physical scientists to review the Condon Report. The panel concurred with Condon's conclusion. The imprimatur was complete. The country had been told, by the United States Air Force, by an independent university committee, and by the National Academy of Sciences, that the question was settled. MacDonald alone, in the months that followed, would publish a piece-by-piece dissection of the Condon Report's methodology, case by case, in the technical journals he could reach. He would document in detail where the body of the report contradicted the summary. He would name the cases the committee's own investigators had been unable to explain. The publications had narrow circulation. The damage was done. 28 years later, in 1997, a CIA historian named Gerald K. Haynes would publish, in the agency's own internal journal, Studies in Intelligence, an article titled CIA's Role in the Study of UFOs, 1947 to 1990. In that article, Haynes made an admission that, in any honest accounting, would have to be stapled to the cover of the Condon Report. He wrote that high-altitude reconnaissance flights of the U-2 and the A-12, classified above the clearance level of Project Blue Book's investigators, accounted for, in his estimate, quote, over half of all UFO reports during the late 1950s and most of the 1960s, end quote. The U-2 flew at 60,000 feet. Airline pilots at 20,000 feet looking up would see silver wings reflecting sunlight at altitudes they considered impossible for any aircraft. They would file UFO reports. The reports would land on the desks of Project Blue Book investigators who, not having the clearance to know that the U-2 existed, could not explain them. Many of those reports went into the file marked unidentified. Haynes's over half figure has been challenged by other historians as an overstatement. The U-2 first flew in 1955, which means it cannot account for the wave that drove the project's creation in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The A-12 first flew in 1962, which means its operational window inside the period in question was narrow. What is not challenged is this: a meaningful fraction of every unidentified case the Air Force had publicly acknowledged for 2 decades was unidentified for one reason. The explanation was classified above the clearance level of the people the public had been told were doing the investigating. The CIA admitted this in 1997. Project Blue Book was never told. On the 17th of December, 1969, 11 months after the Condon Report was published, Secretary of the Air Force Robert C. Seamans, Jr. issued a press release announcing that Project Blue Book would be terminated. Seamans' stated reasons were 2. Continuation of the project, he said, quote, cannot be justified either on the grounds of national security or in the interest of science, end quote. The total numbers, as Project Blue Book had compiled them over its lifetime, were the following: 12,618 reports investigated, 701 cases classified after analysis as unidentified, 701. The press release was dated December 17, 1969. The actual operational closure was 30 days later, on the 30th of January, 1970. The discrepancy is documented in the project's own records. The public announcement was issued in December rather than in January, so that the project's lifetime would not be recorded as having extended into a 4th decade. The date the country saw was a date the Air Force chose. 2 months before the public termination announcement, on the 20th of October, 1969, Brigadier General Carroll H. Rip Bolender, Deputy Director of Development and Acquisitions under the Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for Research and Development, sat down at his desk at Air Force Headquarters and wrote an internal memorandum. The memo was about Project Blue Book. Bolender had been asked, internally, to review the project's status and recommend its disposition. His recommendation was termination. His memo did not stop there. It also clarified in writing for internal Air Force readers how the project's actual reporting workflow was structured. The clarification was a single sentence. We are reading it as he wrote it. Quote, Reports of unidentified flying objects which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP 146 or Air Force Manual 55-11 and are not part of the Blue Book system." End quote. The Bolender Memo, October 20th, 1969. On the letterhead of the Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff, Research and Development, Headquarters, United States Air Force. In the file of the Air Force itself. We need to be careful about what this memo does and does not say. What it does say is this: UFO reports of genuine national security interest were not, and as of October 1969 had not been, processed through Project Blue Book. They were processed through two other channels. JNAP 146, the Joint Army-Navy Air Force publication titled Communications Instructions for Reporting Vital Intelligence Sightings, shared between the United States and Canada, binding on military personnel and civilian aircraft and shipping. And Air Force Manual 55-11, the Air Force Operational Reporting System, issued in May of 1968, which routed time-critical operational reports to major commands, the National Military Command Center, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the White House. What it does not say is that there was a parallel UFO investigation. JNAP 146 and AFM 55-11 are general operational reporting channels. They carry reports of foreign aircraft incursions, missile launches, suspected hostile activity, and any other operationally significant sighting. UFO reports of national security significance flowed through them because they flowed through the channels that carried any such report. What Bolender's memo establishes, then, is the smaller fact. Project Blue Book, the public investigation that the Air Force pointed to in press statements for 22 years, was not the destination of UFO reports the Air Force itself considered nationally significant. Those reports went through operational channels. We do not know what those channels recorded or whether any of those records have ever been declassified. In the Bolender Memorandum's transmittal record, 16 pages of attachments are referenced. Those attachments are missing from the Air Force's files. We do not know what they contained. They may have been the texts of JNAP 146 and AFM 55-11 themselves, both of which are publicly available in their unattached form. Or they may have contained operational specifics that are still classified. They have never been located. They are not in the National Archives. They are not referenced in the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office's Historical Record Report, Volume 1, which acknowledges the Bolender Memorandum's existence. 16 pages. In the file of the United States Air Force. Missing.
This episode is brought to you by What's Near Me Now. Every city has events, shows, and nights out you'd love to hear about, if only someone told you. What's Near Me Now does. Real-time, local, AI curated. Find out what's on, right now, near you. Visit what'snearmenow.com.
Here is what is confirmed. Confirmed. On the 17th of April, 1966, 4 officers, Deputy Sheriff Dale S.P. O.W. Patrolman Wilbur Neff, Patrolman Wayne H.D. Wston, and Patrolman Frank Panzanella, pursued an unidentified object 85 miles across 2 states at speeds they recorded as approximately 103 miles per hour. All 4 officers filed signed statements. Major Hector Quintanilla, director of Project Blue Book, attributed the object to a communications satellite and the planet Venus after a brief telephone interview with one of the 4. Confirmed. On the 17th of May, 1966, Information Officer Eugene F. Rarer of the United States Air Force, in a letter on Air Force letterhead, recorded that Patrolman Wayne H.E. Wston had been driven off his police force by harassment following the Air Force's explanation and had taken employment in another area. Confirmed. On the 9th of October, 1966, Officer Dale S.P. O.W. in an interview with Cleveland Plain Dealer staff writer John DeGroot, carried on the Associated Press wire, described, in his own words, the personal collapse that had followed the case, including the loss of his marriage, his children, his profession, and his health. Confirmed. On the 9th of August, 1966, 3 months before the Condon Committee formally began its work, Robert J. Lowe, the committee's coordinator, wrote an internal memorandum to 2 senior administrators at the University of Colorado, recommending that the project be presented to the public as objective and to the scientific community as appropriately skeptical and oriented towards studying the witnesses rather than the phenomena. He used the word trick to describe the structure he was proposing. Confirmed. On the 24th of February, 1968, Mary Louise Armstrong, Edward Condon's administrative assistant, resigned in a 10-page letter enumerating 9 specific criticisms of Robert Lowe's leadership. In April of 1968, committee members David Saunders and Norman Levine were fired for leaking the Lowe memorandum to outside parties. In May of 1968, the memo was published by John Fuller in Look magazine. Confirmed. On the 29th of July, 1968, Dr. James E. McDonald of the University of Arizona testified before the House Committee on Science and Astronautics. His prepared statement on the public record of the United States Congress described Project Blue Book as scientifically incompetent and predicted that the scientific community at large would be in for a shock when it eventually confronted the phenomenon. Confirmed. On the 7th of October, 1968, J. Allen Hynek, in a letter to Colonel Raymond Sleeper, commander of the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, delivered an 8-point assessment of Project Blue Book. He described the project as inadequately staffed, statistically a travesty, illogical and unscientific, and as having earned, from its critics, the name the Society for the Explanation of the Uninvestigated. Confirmed. In January of 1969, the Condon Report was published. Its summary recommended against further study of UFOs. Its body classified dozens of cases as unidentified. The National Academy of Sciences endorsed the summary. Confirmed. On the 20th of October, 1969, Brigadier General Carroll H. Bullender of Air Force Headquarters wrote an internal memorandum recommending the termination of Project Blue Book and stating in writing that UFO reports of national security significance were processed through JNAP 146 and Air Force Manual 55-11, and were not part of the Blue Book system. 16 pages of attachments referenced in the memorandum are missing from Air Force files. Confirmed. On the 17th of December, 1969, the Air Force announced the termination of Project Blue Book. Operational closure followed on the 30th of January, 1970. The project had received 12,618 reports over its lifetime and had classified 701 of them as unidentified. Confirmed. In 1997, CIA historian Gerald K. Haynes published, in the agency's own internal journal, an estimate that high-altitude reconnaissance flights of the U-2 and A-12, classified above the clearance level of Project Blue Book investigators, accounted for over half of all UFO reports during the late 1950s and most of the 1960s. The estimate has been challenged as overstated. What is not in dispute is that a meaningful fraction of the 701 unidentified cases were unidentified because the relevant explanation was classified above the project's own clearance level. Here's what we do not know. We do not know what is in the 701 cases that Project Blue Book ultimately classified as unidentified. The files are publicly available through the National Archives. They have not, to our knowledge, been analyzed as a single data set. The Air Force studied them case by case. No one has studied them as a system. We do not know how many of the 701 were, in fact, classified aircraft. The CIA's 1997 admission established that high-altitude reconnaissance flights accounted for a significant share of late 1950s and 1960s UFO reports. We do not know how that distribution maps onto Project Blue Book's specific case files. We also do not know what remains unexplained even after the U-2 attribution is applied. We do not know where the JNAP 146 and Air Force Manual 55-11 UFO reports went. The Bullender Memorandum confirms that they exist. It does not name the agency that holds them, the file system in which they are cataloged, or the FOIA process by which they could be requested. The memorandum points at a door. The door has not been opened. We do not know what is on the 16 pages of attachments referenced in the Bullender Memorandum. We do not know whether they were destroyed, classified, misplaced, or never created. They have never surfaced in 55 years. And we do not know what happened to the cases the Condon Committee's own investigators, in the body of the report, had classified as unidentified after the Air Force formally declared the question closed. No one in the United States government was charged with continuing to investigate them, so nobody did. In the room where Robert Lowe typed the trick memo in August of 1966, a verdict was already on the page. The 2.5 years that followed were the trick. The hearings were the trick. The committee was the trick. The press release was the trick. 18 months in, 2 scientists were fired and an administrative assistant resigned. The smoking gun internal memo reached a national magazine. James E. McDonald walked into the United States Congress and said, on the record, that the scientific community would be in for a shock. J. Allen Hynek, on the 7th of October, 1968, sat down at his desk and wrote, in numbered observations, what he had been refusing to write down for 20 years. And in October of 1969, in a memorandum that nobody outside the Air Force read until it was pried out by Freedom of Information requests years later, an Air Force general clarified, in writing, that the public investigation the country had been arguing about for 22 years was not the destination of the reports the Air Force itself considered nationally significant. Reports of unidentified flying objects which could affect national security, he wrote, are made in accordance with JNAP 146 or Air Force Manual 55-11 and are not part of the Blue Book system. Project Blue Book was the part the public was allowed to see. The reports of operational significance were filed in operational channels, and the file the Air Force published about its own filing system is missing 16 pages.
Next time on Unresolved Signals, what got classified? A note on how this show is made. Unresolved Signals is a talentless AI production, produced and directed by Steve Mudd. Research is conducted using Notebook LM. Narration is generated using 11 Labs version 3. Script and source verification is performed using Anthropic's Claude. AI is a powerful research and production tool. We use it openly. We disclose it in every episode. The editorial decisions, the source review, and the guardrails on this show are human. This episode is the 9th in our chronological investigation of the United States government's engagement with the unidentified aerial phenomena question. It is the 3rd and final episode of the Project Blue Book triptych. Every source cited in this episode is linked at unresolvedsignals.com. If you would like to sponsor this show or partner with Unresolved Signals, visit unresolvedsignals.com/sponsor. This has been Unresolved Signals. Every document, every country, every question, every release.